The gunshot echoed across the desert just as Jake Morrison crested the ridge. His horse stumbled on loose rock, and by the time he steadied the animal and looked down into the valley, smoke was already rising from the bank. Glance. 3 riders burst through the doors, saddlebags bulging and scattered in different directions. Jake spurred his mount forward, but the distance was too great. Glance. He was at least 2 minutes behind, maybe 3. The robbery was done. Glance. He rode hard down the slope, dust kicking up behind him. The town of Copper Springs lay quiet in the afternoon heat, except for the cluster of people gathering outside the bank. Glance. As Jake approached, he saw a woman kneeling in the dirt, cradling someone in her arms. The sheriff stood nearby, hat in hand, his face gray. Glance. Jake dismounted and pushed through the small crowd. The woman looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. Glance. In her arms lay a young man, maybe 20 years old, with a bullet wound in his chest. His eyes were already going dim. Glance. "My boy?" the woman whispered. "They shot my boy." The young man had been a clerk at the bank. Glance. His name was Peter, and he had tried to lock the vault when the robbers came in. They put a bullet in him for his trouble. Glance. Jake knelt beside the woman and checked for a pulse, but there was nothing left to save. Peter was gone. Glance. "Did anyone see which way they went?" Jake asked, standing. The sheriff pointed northwest. Glance. "One went that way, the other, 2 split east and south." Glance. They were the Garrett brothers, and their cousin, no doubt about it. Been hitting banks across 3 territories. Glance. Jake studied the horizon. 3 different directions meant 3 different trails to follow. Glance. He was one man with 1 horse. The law would take weeks to organize a proper pursuit, and by then the Garrett gang would be long gone, probably across the border into Mexico. Glance. "I am going after them," Jake said quietly. The sheriff shook his head. Glance. "You are one man, Morrison. They will kill you." Jake looked down at the dead boy, at the mother who would never see her son smile again. Glance. He thought about all the other towns, all the other families the Garretts had destroyed. Someone had to stop them, even if it meant dying in the attempt. Glance. "Maybe," Jake said, "but I am going anyway." He walked back to his horse and checked his supplies. Glance. He had enough water for 3 days if he rationed it carefully. His rifle was loaded, and he carried 2 revolvers on his belt. Glance. The trail northwest was the freshest, the hoofprints still sharp in the dust. That was the one he would follow first. Glance. The mother was still crying as Jake rode out of town. He did not look back. Glance. Looking back never helped anything. The sun was starting its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Glance. He had maybe 4 hours of good light left, and he intended to use every minute of it. The trail led through rocky country, winding between mesas and dry creek beds. Glance. Jake kept his eyes on the ground, reading the signs. The rider he was following was moving fast, but not being careful. Glance. He left clear tracks, broken branches, disturbed stones. Either he was confident no one would follow, or he was inexperienced. Glance. Jake hoped for the latter. As darkness fell, Jake made a cold camp in a shallow canyon. Glance. No fire meant no coffee, but it also meant no beacon to announce his position. He chewed on dried beef and thought about Peter, about all the lives the Garretts had taken. Glance. Tomorrow he would catch up to at least one of them, and when he did, there would be a reckoning. Glance. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Jake was in the saddle before dawn, following the trail as it wound deeper into the wilderness lands. Around midday, he spotted smoke rising from a small grove of cottonwood trees near a dried-up waterhole. Someone had made camp, and they had been foolish enough to build a fire. Jake dismounted a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, rifle in hand. Through the trees, he could see a man sitting by the fire, cooking something in a small pan. The saddlebags from the bank robbery lay open beside him, cash spilling out onto the dirt. The man was young, maybe 30, with a scraggly beard and nervous eyes that kept darting around. Lance. This was not one of the Garrett brothers. This was the cousin, the inexperienced one. Jake could tell by the way he sat, by the careless way he had left his weapons out of reach. The rifle leaned against a tree 10 feet away, and his revolver hung on a saddle another 5 feet beyond that. Lance. Jake stepped out of the trees with his rifle leveled. "Do not move," he said. "Lance." The man froze, his hand halfway to the pan. His eyes went wide with fear. Lance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man slowly raised his hands. "Lance, I did not shoot anyone," he said quickly. "That was Frank Garrett." "Lance, I just held the horses. A boy is dead," Jake said. "Peter was his name." "Lance?" "He was 20 years old." The man swallowed hard. "I did not want any part of it. Frank and his brother, they made me come along. I am just trying to get by." "Lance." Jake studied him carefully. The fear in the man's eyes looked genuine, but fear and guilt often wore the same face. "Lance." "What is your name?" Jake asked. "Danny Cooper," the man said. "Lance, I swear I am telling the truth." Jake kept the rifle steady. "Where did the Garrett brothers go?" Danny hesitated, then pointed south. "Lance." "They were heading for the border. Frank said they had a place in Mexico, a ranch where they could hide out until things cooled down. You were supposed to meet them there. In 2 weeks." "Lance." "At a town called San Miguel, just across the border." Jake considered his options. "Lance." He could take Danny back to Copper Springs to face trial, but that would cost him days and let the real killers escape. "Lance." Or he could leave Danny here and continue the pursuit, but leaving him meant Danny might disappear, might find another gang to join, might rob another bank. "Lance." "Get on your feet," Jake said, slowly. Danny stood, hand still raised. "Lance." Jake walked forward and kicked the revolver farther away, then picked up the rifle and unloaded it. He gathered the money from the saddlebags and stuffed it into his own pack. Then he looked Danny in the eye. "You have a choice," Jake said. "Lance. You can ride back to Copper Springs right now and turn yourself in. Tell them everything you know about the Garretts. Lance. Or you can run, and I will hunt you down after I finish with Frank and his brother. What is it going to be?" Danny's face went pale. "Lance, if I go back, they will hang me." "Maybe," Jake said. "Or maybe the judge will show mercy since you did not pull the trigger." "Lance. But if you run, I promise you this. I will find you, and there will be no mercy." "Lance." The two men stared at each other across the dying fire. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. "Lance." The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves. Danny's hands were shaking. "Lance." "I will go back," he said finally. "I will tell them everything." Jake nodded. He watched as Danny saddled his horse and rode east toward Copper Springs. The man's shoulders slumped in defeat. When Danny was out of sight, Jake mounted his own horse and turned south. Ants. 2 more to go. 2 more men who needed to answer for what they had done. Ants. The trail led through increasingly harsh country. Water became scarce, and the sun beat down with relentless intensity. Ants. Jake rationed his supplies carefully, but he knew he was running low. Another 2 days at most, and he would have to turn back or risk dying of thirst. Plants. On the 3rd day, he found their camp. It was in a narrow canyon with steep walls on 3 sides, a natural fortress. Plants. Jake approached carefully, using the rocks for cover. He could hear voices echoing off the canyon walls, 2 men arguing about something. He crept closer until he could see them. Frank Garrett was a big man, well over 6 feet, with a thick black beard and cold eyes. His brother Martin was smaller but meaner looking, with a scar running down his left cheek. They were dividing the money from the robbery, arguing over who deserved the larger share. Jake had found them. Now came the hard part. 2 against 1, and both men were experienced killers. He could try to take them by surprise, but in this enclosed space, even if he got one, the other would have time to find cover and return fire. The smart play was to wait until they moved out into open country, but Jake did not know if he had enough water to outlast them. He was still weighing his options when his horse, tied up 50 yards back, whinnied loudly. Frank and Martin both grabbed their weapons and dove for cover. Jake cursed under his breath and brought his rifle up, knowing his chance for surprise was gone. The hunt had just become a fight, and only one side was going to walk away. Frank's voice boomed out from behind a boulder. "Who is out there?" "Show yourself or start shooting, because we are not going anywhere." Jake stayed silent, scanning for a clear shot. The canyon walls trapped the heat and made everything shimmer. Sweat ran down his back. His mouth was dry, and his water canteen was almost empty. Time was not on his side. "Maybe it is the law," Martin called out. "Maybe they finally caught up." "1 horse," Frank replied. "I only heard 1 horse. Law travels in groups." "This is something else." Jake shifted position, moving between 2 large rocks. As he moved, a small stone rolled down the slope, clattering against the canyon floor. Instantly, both brothers opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Jake, sending chips of stone flying. He pressed himself flat against the ground and waited for the shooting to stop. When silence returned, Frank called out again. "You picked a bad place to die, stranger. There is only one way out of this canyon, and we have got it covered." "You can either come out now and we will make it quick, or you can wait and die of thirst. Your choice." Jake said nothing. He was studying the canyon walls, looking for another option. The rock face was nearly vertical, but there were cracks and handholds. If he could climb high enough, he might be able to get an angle on their position. It was risky, but staying put was certain death. He slung his rifle across his back and began to climb. The rock was hot enough to burn his hands, and his boots kept slipping on the smooth stone. Below, he heard the brothers talking in low voices, trying to figure out where he had gone. He climbed higher, his arms burning with effort. When he was about 30 feet up, he found a narrow ledge and pulled himself onto it. From here, he could see down into the canyon. Frank and Martin were still behind their respective boulders, watching the entrance. Lance. Jake carefully unslung his rifle and took aim. The distance was maybe 80 yards, and he would only get one shot before they figured out where he was. Lance. He chose Frank as his target. The bigger man was the more dangerous one, the leader. Lance. Take him out, and Martin might lose his nerve. Jake steadied his breathing and squeezed the trigger. Lance. The rifle cracked, and Frank jerked backward, dropping his weapon. Martin screamed his brother's name and opened fire blindly, spraying bullets in every direction. Lance. Jake pressed himself against the cliff face as rounds pinged off the rock around him. When Martin's revolver clicked empty, Jake called out, Lance. Your brother is done, Martin. You can end this now. Lance. Throw out your weapons and we will ride back to face trial. Martin's response was to reload and fire again. Lance. Jake could hear the man sobbing between shots, grief and rage mixed together. You killed him, Martin screamed. Lance. You killed Frank. He killed an innocent boy, Jake shouted back. Peter was his name. Lance. He was 20 years old, and Frank shot him dead for trying to protect some money. Your brother had it coming. Lance. I will kill you, Martin yelled. I will kill you for this. Jake reloaded his rifle and waited. Lance. Martin was making noise, which meant Jake could track his position. The man was moving, working his way around the canyon floor, trying to get closer to the cliff where Jake was perched. Lance. It was a foolish move, driven by emotion rather than strategy. Jake watched through the rifle scope as Martin emerged from cover, still looking for a shot. The man's face was red with tears and fury. He was not thinking clearly, not being careful. Lance. Jake took aim and fired again. Martin went down hard, clutching his leg. Lance. Next one goes through your chest, Jake called out. Throw away your gun. For a long moment, Martin just lay there, breathing hard. Glance. Then, slowly, he tossed his revolver away. Jake climbed down from the ledge, his legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Lance. He kept his rifle trained on Martin as he approached. Frank Garrett was dead, shot through the heart. Lance. Martin was bleeding from his thigh, but the wound was not fatal if treated quickly. Jake tied Martin's hands and used strips of cloth to bandage the leg wound. Then he dragged the injured man into the shade and gave him water. Why? Martin asked through gritted teeth. Lance. Why did you come after us? You are not the law. Lance. I am just a man who is sick of watching people like you get away with murder, Jake said. Peter deserved better, Lance. His mother deserved better. All your victims deserved better, Lance. We needed the money, Martin said weakly. Everyone needs money, Jake replied. Lance. Most people do not kill for it, Lance. He buried Frank in a shallow grave and marked it with stones. Then he loaded Martin onto his horse and began the long journey back to Copper Springs. Lance. The money from the robbery was recovered, every dollar accounted for. Danny Cooper had made it back to town and was already in jail, cooperating with the authorities. Lance. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the courtroom as Martin Garrett was sentenced to hang for murder and robbery. Danny Cooper received 15 years in prison for his role in the crime. Lance. The money was returned to the bank, and Peter's mother used her share to start a scholarship fund in her son's name. The judge asked Jake if he had anything to say. Lance. Jake looked at Martin, then at Peter's mother sitting in the front row. I rode in too late to stop the crime, he said quietly. Lance. But I hope what happened next means something. I hope it means that people who do evil do not always get away with it, Lance. I hope it means that Peter did not die for nothing. The courtroom was silent, Lance. Peter's mother nodded, tears running down her face. She mouthed the words, "Thank you, Lance." Jake tipped his hat to her and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. His horse was waiting at the hitching post, saddlebags packed and ready to go, Lance. He did not know where he would ride next, but he knew there would always be another town, another crime, another chance to make things right. Some men were born to build, some to create, some to lead, Lance. Jake Morrison was born to chase shadows and bring them into the light. It was not the life he had chosen, but it was the life he had, Lance. And he would live it until his last breath, making sure that the guilty faced justice and the innocent were remembered. He mounted his horse and rode west toward the setting sun, leaving Copper Springs behind, Lance. The dust rose up in small clouds with each step, and somewhere in the distance a lone coyote howled. Jake did not look back. Lance. He never did, Lance. The past was the past, and all that mattered was the next horizon. Years would pass, and people in Copper Springs would still talk about the stranger who rode in after the robbery, the man who tracked down the Garrett gang and brought them to justice. They would tell their children about Jake Morrison, about how one man with enough determination could change the course of events, could turn a tragedy into something that meant more than just death and loss. Lance. Peter's scholarship fund would send dozens of young people to school over the decades, giving them opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Some would become doctors, others teachers, others engineers and artists and leaders. Lance. Each one carried forward a piece of Peter's legacy, transformed from a senseless death into something that gave life and hope to others. And somewhere out on the frontier, Jake Morrison continued his lonely vigil, riding from town to town, bringing justice where the law could not reach. Lance. He never sought fame or recognition. He never told his story to anyone who would listen. Lance. He simply did what needed to be done, one case at a time, one criminal at a time, one family at a time, Lance. The West was a hard place, full of hard men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. But it was also a place where one person could make a difference, where courage and determination could overcome the odds, Lance. Jake proved that every day, with every mile he rode, with every wrong he tried to right, he never forgot Peter's face or the sound of his mother crying in the street, Lance. Those memories stayed with him through all his travels, through all the fights and close calls and long, lonely nights under the stars. They reminded him why he did what he did, why he could not stop, why he would never stop as long as there was breath in his body and strength in his arms. Lance. The sun continued its journey across the sky, day after day, season after season. Towns grew and changed. New people arrived, old ones departed. But the need for justice never changed, Lance. The need for someone to stand up and say enough, to draw a line and defend it, that need remained constant. Jake Morrison was not a hero in the traditional sense, Lance. He did not wear a badge or carry the authority of any government. He was just a man with a rifle and a horse, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. Lance. He was just a man who happened to crest that ridge at the moment the shots were fired, who happened to see the smoke and the fleeing robbers, who happened to decide that this time someone would pay for the crime. He rode in too late to stop it, Lance, but not too late to change what it meant, not too late to ensure that Peter's death would save others, not too late to turn a moment of violence into a legacy of hope. And in the end, perhaps that was the only kind of justice that truly mattered, Lance. Not the justice that prevented all bad things from happening, because that was impossible, but the justice that ensured bad things had consequences, that ensured victims were remembered and honored, that ensured the guilty did not simply ride away into the sunset unpunished. Lance, Jake Morrison understood this in his bones. He carried it with him like a second heartbeat, steady and sure. Lance, and as long as he rode, as long as he breathed, he would continue to be that consequence, that reckoning, that voice crying out in the wilderness that some things were wrong and would not be tolerated. The trail stretched out before him, endless and dusty and full of unknown dangers. Lance. He did not know what waited around the next bend, what town would need him next, what crime would demand his attention. But he would be ready, Lance. He was always ready, because that was who he was, and that was what he did. Lance. The legacy of that day in Copper Springs would ripple outward for generations, touching lives that Jake would never know about, creating changes he would never witness. But he did not need to see the results to know they were real, Lance. He had faith that good actions produced good outcomes, that standing up against evil made the world a better place even if only by the smallest degree. And so he rode on, a solitary figure against the vast landscape, neither saint nor villain but something in between, Lance. A man doing his best in a world that often did not reward such efforts. A man who refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. A man who understood that sometimes you arrive too late to prevent the tragedy, but just in time to give it meaning, Lance. The hoofbeats echoed across the empty land, steady and rhythmic. A heartbeat in the silence. Jake Morrison rode west, always west, toward the setting sun and whatever lay beyond the next horizon, Lance. He was tired, he was weathered, he was scarred by 100 close calls and narrow escapes. But he was not done, Lance. Not yet. Not while there were still wrongs to right and families to protect and legacies to preserve, Lance. He thought about Peter one more time, about the young man who tried to be brave and paid the ultimate price. He thought about the mother who lost her son but found a way to honor his memory, Lance. He thought about the ripples spreading outward from that one terrible moment, ripples that would continue long after Jake himself was gone. And he smiled just a little, because he knew that he had done something that mattered, Lance. He had ridden too late to save Peter, yes, but he had ridden just in time to make sure Peter's death changed things, made things better, created something lasting and good out of something horrible and wrong. Lance, that was enough. That had to be enough, Lance, because it was all anyone could ever really do, Lance. Show up, do your best, fight the good fight, and hope that somewhere down the line, someone would benefit from your efforts, even if you never knew about it, Lance. Jake Morrison tipped his hat to the empty sky and rode on into the gathering twilight, a ghost of justice in a land that desperately needed such ghosts, Lance. And behind him, in a small town called Copper Springs, a young student opened a book purchased with scholarship money, never knowing that she owed her education to a clerk named Peter and a rider named Jake, and a